we already know the immune system is suppressed from these emissions. Further suppression, having a device that actually propagates virus and bacteria at an accelerated rate, may be not a good thing for us to have.
Hello and welcome to the Ultimate Health Podcast, episode 264. Jesse Chappus here with Marni Wasserman, and we are here on a weekly basis to take your health to the next level. This week, our featured guest is Daniel DeBaun. He's an internationally recognized and influential expert in shielding electronic emissions and EMF protection, with a particular focus on the effect of exposure from mobile devices such as laptops, tablets, and cell phones. He's the co-author of the best-selling book Radiation Nation, and he's the inventor of DefenderShield, the most effective EMF radiation protection technology for mobile devices ever developed.
Jesse and I, in fact, recorded this episode with our DefenderShield headphones, and we just got hooked up with 2 new shields for under our laptops and phone cases. And if you guys stay tuned at the end of the episode, we have a special discount code for you. It's so amazing to be able to bring this conversation about EMFs forward. This is such a relevant topic as the health effects and the impact of EMFs on our life is still being determined, and people are feeling the effect of this, and people are still wanting to know what this is doing to us. And thanks to people like Daniel who are getting this information out there. And we cover a lot of this on our show today. We talk about what EMFs are, the impact of EMFs on male and female reproductive organs, children and their link to EMFs, and also the association with ADHD, the danger of microwave use, why you should embrace airplane mode, sources of EMFs around your home, and how EMFs impact your sleep. So much juicy information. We're so excited about this conversation. Here we go with Daniel DeBaun.
Hello, Dan, and welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Well, I'm doing wonderful. Thanks so much for inviting me, Jesse, and I look forward to chatting with you today.
We're super excited to have you on the show, and we're excited to get into the conversation of EMFs and so much more, especially the harm that it's doing to us. This is something that we've only lightly touched upon on the podcast, but we haven't had a chance to really delve into it. So we've got lots to ask you.
Okay, shoot away.
So, Dan, I think an important part to get into early on is some definitions. Make sure we're all on the same page here. And a basic definition that would be great to start with is electromagnetic fields, or EMF. So if you can explain what that is.
Okay. In nature, there is an electrical/magnetic emission from the Earth itself up to 12 hertz. That's 12 cycles per second. That is a DC, direct current emission. Other than that, everything else in our environment is man-made. So what is the man-made stuff that is being emitted within our environment? It turns out that when you have any electrical current, when you have a light plugged in, there's wiring in the walls. When you have a refrigerator turned on, there's a coil in your refrigerator motor that are generating what is called extremely low frequency emissions. And what that is 3-dimensional moving sine wave that's going out from those sources. And it's an emission that can be measured in its strength based on the sources typically. So that's one source. Most of those sources are pretty safe with. And distance, of course, is one of the ways you can sort of be more safe, but we'll get into that a little bit more. The other electromagnetic radiation is from all our devices that we have around us every day. It's called radio frequency or microwave emissions. When you have a cell phone and you're connecting to a cell tower, you're using a electromagnetic frequency to connect to the cell tower. When you have a laptop using a Wi-Fi, that is an RF microwave signal that's connecting to your Wi-Fi. And of course, if you have Bluetooth that you use when you're in your car and you're hands-free, there's a communications path, which is an RF path, a radio frequency path, and it's connecting you from the cell phone to the electronic devices within your car. What does it look like? Stick your finger up in the air and pretend that there's a little ball right at the very tip. And that little ball is getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. It's in waves, omnidirectional waves going in all directions. And for a cell phone, for example, it can go up to 5 miles. So it goes out of your room and it goes into the air until it hits the tower. So it's that electromagnetic combination that is called RF or microwave.
So just to summarize that for the listener, there's two forms of EMF, the ELF and the RF.
That's correct.
Okay, and Dan, early on you talked about the fact that the Earth actually emits EMF, and that's a natural source. In the book, you also touched on how the sun, the stars, and the sky can emit EMF. So can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, there are emissions outside of the Earth, just like the Earth itself generates an electromagnetic emission. So does the stars and Earths outside the Earth that are generating the same thing. But there's a really big difference between those that I need to clarify. There are DC, there are direct current emission. So there's no real sine wave that you worry about as much as you do with the electromagnetic radiation that's being transmitted out of your cell phone or your Wi-Fi. That is an AC, alternating current, that is more of a combination of both.
So you're obviously really knowledgeable in this subject, and you have written a book, Radiation Nation. When did you first become fascinated and concerned with EMFs? When did this start?
That's actually a great story. It turns out about 6 years ago or so, I had my family visiting. Before that, for some like 30 some odd years, I ran the technical laboratories and did the testing and developed standards for the industry for the telecom space. So I was pretty familiar with our electrical environment. So I'm sitting there. My wife says to my boys, who are men, that she wants grandchildren. She's thinking that a laptop on the lap for hours can't be good for you. So she had some intuition that that may be a problem for the groin area for the male, and by the way, for the female as well. And so I thought about it a little bit, and I said, well, I know what is being admitted, and I don't think it's dangerous. These are very, very low level emissions, and I would be surprised if there was any evidence that there could be dangers. I went into the research side of the electronics world, and I was sort of stunned. I found out even back then, over 25% of the male sperm is immobile after 3 or 4 hours of exposure from a laptop on a lap. I was surprised when I found that kind of substantiated evidence even back then. And so I decided to build some devices for my sons to use to protect their area. They started giving it to their friends and their friends. And so I started building these things for neighbors and friends. And fast forward today, I now run a company that brings shielding to a very large population. And oh, by the way, I don't have grandchildren yet.
And your company's DefenderShield. And in there, Dan, you touched on how the females and the males are affected, and you touched on the motility of the sperm. But can you get into how females are affected if a laptop's on their lap?
Yeah, it turns out that there actually is a pretty substantive evidence. And when I say that, it's statistically significant. In other words, it's likely replicable because the statistics are broad. And so there was a study in Italy, 5 years ago or so. And what they did was they looked at womb exposures to females when there was close proximity to these transmitting devices. And what they found was there was a 2% tumor instance. And of that, a small portion became cancerous. And so when I began realizing that that kind of damage can happen to a womb back then, that even drove me to think about how we can deal with these in our environment. Fast forward, by the way, we know, for example, today, because there's been so much research, you are 3 times more likely to have a miscarriage if you're a young woman and you have excess exposures. There was a recent study in San Francisco, actually, and what they found is you're 3 times more likely if the exposures are significant to the womb. there is multiple sources of evidence that suggests you need to be careful with these devices around your body, particularly if you have them close to the very sensitive parts of the body.
Other than the miscarriages, is there any other impacts that EMFs have on pregnant women?
Yes. In fact, Dr. Martin Powell, he's been looking at the exposure to the cell and what happens to the cell. And he actually is the researcher that's been pretty advanced in his ability to identify the breakdown of the cell and the various stages and how it breaks down. And he talks about the closeness of a cell phone to the womb. It is his work that's suggesting that that level of exposure close to the womb can actually mutate a cell of a young woman. And he's suggesting that if there's DNA damaged cells that then repair and become mutated cells, they can actually be found in subtending generations. So they're talking about not only is there a potential miscarriage, but if there's a constant exposure to these kinds of emissions over long periods of time, that can damage the cells, which could transcend your own body into your subtending generations. So they're thinking that's a very serious, almost epidemic in 3 to 4 generations from now. I actually don't think so, but some researchers are thinking that's true. So it can be very serious in some people's view.
And just to expand on this, what about children who are exposed to this in school, who are playing video games, who I know you also mentioned something about children being in strollers at a young age. So what about this exposure?
I'm a 6-foot male, right? And I have a very thick skull. Many people tell me that. My brain is evolved. Well, if you're a 6-year-old child, your brain hasn't evolved. It's very, very soft tissue, much more than mine. Your skull is very, very thin, still evolving. So in general, you're 3 times more likely to absorb emissions than an adult. If you look at the standards for cell phones, a standard for cell phones says that the power level of a cell phone can't penetrate a 6-foot male by more than 1 inch and can't heat up by more than 2 degrees. Why did I say 2 degrees? Well, the standard is looking at the microwave. Remember I mentioned an RF signal is a microwave? When you take a piece of meat and put it in a microwave oven, the water between the cells heat up and the cells themselves oscillate. And voila, you have cooked meat. The standard for cell phone power levels is written around the thermal impact. And it does, in the statistical sense, increase that area by more than 2 degrees. Why did I give all that explanation? Because if you're a 6-year-old child, that same signal goes completely through your head. And so, am I so much worried about the heat of that signal at that point? What we learned today is that we're more concerned about the biological impact far more than we are the thermal impact. Although many of us feel it, long-term neurological issues are related to the biological impact, not the thermal.
Well, can you elaborate a little bit on that biological impact?
In recent epidemiology work, the federal government a few years ago spent $25 million, and their intent was to have statistically significant evidence that there was no danger to a cell phone to the brain. That was the intent. So the National Toxicity Program, which is a division of the federal government, went ahead and created an isolated environment. They took these cell phone transmitters, which are the typical transmitters that we use today, and they had the study population within this framework. And they had another population that was not exposed. Much to the surprise of the study, they found there was a statistically significant increase in the frontal lobe with tumor and cancer. Another really surprising observation was it was to the heart too. So if you think about it, these are very, very soft parts of the body. Those parts of the body that were affected in the study were those soft parts. That was sort of an important finding last year, and it continued to this year. Then the Maserati Institute out of Italy did even a larger study. And interestingly enough, they had the same somewhat identical findings of statistical evidence that suggested the frontal lobe and the heart cancer. So, as you may know, epidemiology typically is the forefront of human response when you do these kinds of studies. So these were significant conclusions. Beyond that, we have many, many, many recent studies that talk about many, many impacts to the body, but typically they don't have 10,000 patients. They have 500, they have 200. That doesn't create a statistical base so you can determine statistical significance. Dr. Ali Johansson, who's an associate of ours, he works out of Sweden, and he's been doing study for years and years and years, particularly about electromagnetic hypersensitivity. And we know more than 20% of us, the total population, is hypersensitive. Of that, by the way, 80% are women. We don't know why, but we know for sure those statistics are increasing in time. So Ali did some recent work, and he not only found and substantiated many others talking about the impacts of electromagnetic hypersensitivity, but he also found it suppresses the immune system as well. So now there's growing evidence that it's not just the cell you worry about. It's not just the 4,000 plus processes of the body you're worried about, but in a lesser way, it is as important as the breakdown of the cell with that kind of work. So we do have lots of evidence. You know, the neurological stuff that's going on. We just spoke about the damage to the cell within the brain. We didn't talk about headaches, eyes hurting, and other kind of temporary influences to the neurological side of the brain. We also know there are long-term impacts. Things such as ADHD have been linked in studies. There's been Alzheimer's. Some argue that it's within the womb it starts, where a child's impacted from exposures. So we have lots and lots of growing evidence that there's some fairly near-term problems, but some pretty serious long-term problems.
And I want to get back to the microwave. I know you used it as an example to explain what's happening to our brain, but what about the actual use of the microwave? What do you have to say about this, about people having them in their home?
Marni, you may know, when you cook meat or any food using a microwave, it actually takes the cell and can convert it from a healthy, very palatable food to a carcinogenic. The reason why you may want to think about not using microwaves is because there can be a conversion of the cells themselves to become a carcinogenic. So I don't use microwave ovens. I never will. That's sort of a function of a microwave. And then, of course, there's the secondary concern about leakage, microwave leakage. If you're close by a microwave and you're cooking, I can guarantee you, I don't care how much money you spend, those microwaves are coming out of that oven and they're hitting you if you're close by. If you're within a few feet, it can disrupt your body. If you're 5 feet, 4 or 5 feet away or more, you're fine. Distance with these kinds of things is always your best friend.
I'm so happy you talked about this. Jesse and I haven't used a microwave in probably over 10, if not 20 years. So this is something we advocate, but it's important to bring the science and the information to our listeners so that they can make their own decision. But we are right there with you.
Now we're going to take a quick break from our chat with Dan to give a shout out to our show partner, Perfect Keto.
Super exciting news. Perfect Keto just came out with their very own bar. Keto bars that are loaded with good healthy fat, good healthy protein. It's got almond butter, cacao butter, coconut oil, collagen, and a touch of sea salt and stevia. And it's got 19 grams of fat, 10 grams of protein from collagen, and 3 grams of net carbs. So the flavor is almond butter brownie. We are so excited. This is a company that is always innovating, coming out with new things, and the bars are brand new, hot off the press, and we are excited to try them, and we hope you guys are too.
As a listener of our show, you get an incredible discount on the bars for the month of November, and that is 30% off. And to take advantage, go to ultimatehealthpodcast.com/keto bars. Again, that URL is ultimatehealthpodcast.com/keto bars. You can also use the coupon code TUHPBARS30. And as always, you get 20% off all the Perfect Keto products always by going to ultimatehealthpodcast.com/perfectketo. Again, that URL is ultimatehealthpodcast.com/perfectketo. Go and load up on these new bars today. Marni and I are going to do so as well.
And now a shout out to other show partner, Thrive Market. If you're in the USA and you're looking to start shopping online, get over to Thrive Market right now. And an awesome category to search under is condiments. I am sure you love condiments just as much as the next person. There is so many options for adding a little zip to your food. This includes things like organic ketchup, mustard, hot sauces, coconut aminos, salsa, salad dressings, olives. The list goes on, and Thrive Market has them all. And they also have them at 20 to 50% off of regular retail value. So this saves you a trip going to the grocery store or a health food store. You're getting it so much cheaper. And you're also getting 25% off your entire order, plus a 30-day free trial and free shipping.
To take advantage of this incredible offer, go to ultimatehealthpodcast.com/Thrive Market. Again, that URL is ultimatehealthpodcast.com/Thrive Market. Go and take advantage today. You can thank us later. And now back to our show with Dan. Dan, I want to take some time and dig into one of the biggest offenders when it comes to EMF, at least in my mind, and that is the cell phone. I know we've touched on this to this point, but I want to take some time and really dig in and talk about the EMFs coming off these devices.
Okay, so here's an interesting set of facts you probably don't even realize. When I talk about a cell phone, there are actually 4 potential emissions coming off a cell phone. You have the Bluetooth, the Wi-Fi, and the RF transmitters themselves. Those are 3 transmitters that are always transmitting, even when they're not being used. And then the 4th is extreme low frequency stuff. But it's a DC signal, but it is still real. And typically at up to as much as 9 or so milligauss. So there is real observable emissions. And that's a good point you make, because I often tell people, if you don't use your Wi-Fi or you don't use your Bluetooth, turn them off. You don't need them. There is a more present set of emissions in your environment when you have more and more transmitters in the room. You always want to reduce the number of emissions. But let me tell you why it's sort of important to do that for some of us. Jesse, if you're concussed, your blood-brain barrier has likely been hampered and maybe dysfunctional.
Okay.
Why is that important to know? Well, because it's protecting your brain. It's actually protecting you from toxins, including electromagnetic radiation. When your blood-brain barrier is down, you can have 0.1 watts per kilogram mutate your cell in the brain. 0.1 watts per kilogram. That's really, really, really small. A cell phone is 1.6 watts per kilogram. That's the maximum the FCC allows. And so when people say to you, oh, I use Bluetooth, that's much more safe than a cell phone, it's not true. Research literature has clearly found that even the very smallest, the very minute exposures to those very low level emissions can actually influence the cell. Will that influence your cell? Probably not. We're talking about a fairly small percent, but nevertheless, some of us are more susceptible than others because of our body function at the time of exposure.
So you mentioned shutting off the Bluetooth and Wi-Fi when we're not using it. When we put our phone in airplane mode, is that totally protecting us from all the different EMF?
Largely, yes. Not the ELF, but that's very low. And if you're only a few feet away, it's not a big deal at all. But generally speaking, when you have it in airplane mode, you're pretty safe. Now, that doesn't mean it's not transmitting. It does ping every so often. But that instance are transient, really minute transient transmissions. These are not the kind of thing you should worry about. So if you can, always put it in airplane mode. If you have the capacity to reduce the number of transmitters in a room, then do it. Here's an analogy. 1 bee won't kill you. 1,000 bees will. If you think about these transmitters, the more transmitters you have in the room, the more likely those transmitters will impact the body. So when you can turn them off, do it. When you can put them in airplane mode, do it. If you don't need them, completely turn them off, do it. That brings safety to the environment, at least the environment that's closest to you.
And I know even when you're in airplane mode, you have to be careful that the Wi-Fi is turned off, because I know a lot of times when we travel and I shut off the cellular data and I'm in airplane mode, I'll put the Wi-Fi on. So that can get switched on, so people need to look out for that. So Dan, I want to pivot things into smartwatches. These have become super popular over the last number of years, and I'd just love to hear your thoughts on what kind of EMF these are producing and emitting.
I'll tell you a story about that. I try to be healthy as I can, and I had a yoga instructor that I went to for years, and one Christmas she came to me and she had one of these little things around her wrist. She said, "Look what I got, isn't this wonderful?" And I looked at her and I knew that there was a Bluetooth transmitter in it that was constantly interconnecting to the cell phone, constantly updating vitals to her body. And I said, "What are you, crazy? You know I'm in this space, and a Bluetooth signal that's close to the body is 0.3 watts per kilogram, 0.3 watts. And I explained to you before, 0.1 watt can influence the cell if a blood-brain barrier is down. So I don't particularly like them, because if there's no real benefit, why would you run the risk of an exposure that potentially can bother you? That's precautionary measures is what we call it. You want to take precautionary measures when you can.
I agree. And I want to talk about smart meters. This is something I'd heard of before, but I actually had to look it up before the interview to see exactly what they are. So if you want to start off by describing what these are and how they're impacting our health.
Okay. You have a house and you've got this wire coming from the telephone pole to your house. It gets terminated on a box. And within that box is a bubble that shows you how much electricity you're using all the time. When the meter person comes and reads it, they can see how much power you used, and they can charge you for how much power you've used. So that's what an electrical termination does. If it's a smart meter, they don't need a meter person to come look at it. It's actually transmitting a signal to a central location, just like a cell phone. It's very close to a cell phone frequency, and it communicates to the home office exactly how much electricity you use. So that's a smart meter. In other words, it's an active cell phone. It's another bee in the room. Is it a problem? Well, if it's on the garage, you have two cars in between, and you're in the house, there's no way that transmission could ever bother you at all, because the distance of that power is enough where it has negligible, if any, impact to your body. On the other hand, if this wire terminates right outside your bedroom and there's a smart meter that's transmitting day and night, 192 times a day, it can be transmitting into your bedroom. Not a good thing. So really, it depends on where it is. If it's on the garage, don't panic. If it's next to your bedroom, move your bed, because it's a constant transmission that could interfere with your sleep.
So Dan, would this be similar with the Nest, the heating systems that people are using now that are all electronic and you can turn them on and off from your phone? Would that be a similar emission?
Most of those things are only receivers. So you can control it because you're transmitting to it, but they don't transmit themselves. If they have a transmitter on it, then they could themselves become like Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is always on. It's always saying, who wants to connect to the internet? It's always on, always transmitting. If you have a Wi-Fi transmitter in an Apple TV, a device you use with your television to watch new shows, those are transmitting all the time. So anywhere there's an electronic device that's receiving or transmitting, that's when you worry about it.
So just to go through some of the other sources of EMFs in the home, we've got some of the wiring that's happening behind our walls and ceilings. We've got electric blankets, microwaves like we talked about, alarm clocks, hair dryers. Are there other things that we should be considering or looking at or paying attention to in our homes?
I'd like to comment about the hairdryer. When you talk about extreme low frequency emissions, the way in which you characterize its power level is by milligauss. How many milligauss does it have? It turns out a hairdryer exceeds 150 milligauss. That's a lot of stuff being transmitted when you're drying your hair. The good part about it is that you can use it a little bit away from you and for a short period of time, and your hair is dry. So the time duration is really helping offset the potential exposure. Toasters have 150 milligauss or higher. So when you're toasting toast, don't sit next to it. Stay away from it by several feet. In fact, there's a rule that I've hinted about in here that you probably should be aware of. If you have a cell phone to your head directly, that's 1.6 watts per kilogram that's actually being transmitted into your brain. That's the highest potential for damage or danger. And by the way, cell phone manufacturers tell you never do that. In the very, very fine print, make sure it's 5/8 of an inch away, 9/10 of an inch away. They never tell you to put it against your head because of liability concerns. But anyway, so you have that signal of 1.6 watts. 1 foot away, 80% of that danger is gone. 1 foot away, 80%. Why does that happen? Because the power level of 1.6 watts is actually diminished substantially. It's a logarithmic function. It really drops off really, really fast. And so 80% of the danger is gone. By 4 foot, 98%. So the farther away you are, and it doesn't have to be much, the far better you are for it. So you may want to think about that rule when you're looking to manage your environment, reducing the number of bees in the room and keeping distance for those things that you have in the room.
And I think that's really helpful. I think a lot of people will start taking that on right away. And you also have several products, your DefenderShield product line, and some amazing things that people can use. But I'm curious about some of the stuff that's been around for years. I've been aware of EMFs for so long, and I've collected everything from buttons to stickers to chips, all kinds of stuff. Even my hairdryer right now has a little sticker on it. So just a comment on those, because I'm sure a lot of people listening might have some of these devices. What's the efficacy of them? Just anything you can share on those.
Those products, some of them been around for a while, may or may not work. The products that we've tested in our laboratories don't work. So it's hard to say, but roughly in general, they're not really going to bring the protection you think they're bringing. So it becomes more of a placebo than a reality for protection. What I always tell everyone to do when making a choice about bringing protection in their environment, look at the evidence from a source unrelated to the claim. In other words, if the manufacturer of the product is gone to another facility qualified to establish the performance of that product and document it, and it's a independent, unbiased view, that's the way you'll know it works. Most of the time, most of those products don't do that. In fact, they talk about the way in which it functions. And for me, it's not physics. It's somebody's perception of what they think something's going on, but it's not physics that I understand anyway.
Well, I want to talk about a few of your different products, the DefenderShield line. And Marni and I, we connected via video quickly at the beginning of this chat, and you noticed that we're wearing the AirTube headphones. So I'd just love for you to comment on how that works. This is probably a new technology for a lot of people. Explain how that works and what they're doing.
Okay. We spoke about what is electromagnetic radiation. And in the description, I talked about an omnidirectional signal. It starts really, really small, and it can go up to 5 miles in all directions trying to connect to a cell tower. What our products do is we prevent the transmitter from transmitting in one direction. So when you have a cell phone and you use one of our products, we actually have a shield that prevents that omnidirectional signal from going through and touching the body. And that's true for all of our products. We have a shielding technology that we use that basically eliminates any of the transmission from penetrating your body. In the case of the earbuds, that was sort of interesting. What we did, because we couldn't find a way of shielding it, we actually took the electrical signal and we converted to an acoustical connection. In other words, there's a little speaker that's now way down in the wire. We convert to an analog tone and we put it into a tube and we bring the tube to your ears. In other words, we totally eliminate any electronics from touching any of the head at all. That's a product that is slightly different than our other products, but its intent, as all of our products are to eliminate the emissions that are in our environment that could be harmful.
And when it comes to the AirTube headphones, I've heard before somebody mention that you're not getting the EMF necessarily to the head, but where that speaker is and where it meets at your chest, that area is getting the EMFs, maybe even in a concentrated form. So can you talk on that and maybe dispel that myth?
Definitely. First of all, it's not RF. So when people start thinking that the exposure is like bad, you're talking about ELF, DC ELF. It's not the RF because the RF is already in a digital form within the wire. You're only talking about the ELF, which is a digital emission. It turns out the power levels are so low, they have very little capacity to transmit more than a half a foot or so, and then there's virtually no danger at all. When we do the conversion, we do it very low on the body, and it's typically not touching the body. So to compromise, we brought it as far down as we could, closest to the device we could, and the conversion is what protects you. We've eliminated from the speaker up, and that down to the cell phone itself is a very, very low-level emission that could bother you if it went to your head, but is less likely to bother you on your lower part of the body. It's the soft tissue you're worried about. When I have a cell phone in my hand, I'm often asked, is that a problem? And I said, I've never heard of anybody dying of cancer from an exposure from a cell phone in their hand. What do I mean by that? The body itself, the hand, the muscles, the bones are far more capable of resisting the exposure that there is typically no real danger. So if you're in speaker mode, for example, and you're talking with the phone in your hand, you don't have to worry about it, that hand. And that's true for several other parts of the body, hands, feet, even torso.
So when it comes to the devices for the laptop, the pad that goes under the laptop, and the cell phone, the case that goes around it, that's where the blocking comes in that you're explaining before, where it's actually blocking the signal?
Yeah, exactly.
And when it comes to a cell phone, when it's in that case, can it actually receive a phone call, or is the signal blocked at that point?
Jesse, that's a great question. If we actually put the shielding all the way around the cell phone wouldn't ring.
And that's my question, yeah.
Right, it wouldn't ring. So what we do is we put it on one side, and it allows the transmission to be unimpeded to the cell tower. It works fine, but towards your body, it's restricted from touching your body. And that's the simple way it works.
Perfect. Well, we're going to definitely invest in a couple of the laptop pads and the cell phone cases after this interview. So good to know.
I knew I wouldn't throw my cell phone away. Before I started building these products, I actually wouldn't have a cell phone close to me. I always kept it 4 foot away or more. And so you would never see me carry one, only for that reason alone. And my experience was from years ago when they had those things that touched on your belt and you'd be paged, and they used RF transmitters at that time. And I found at that time, 40 years ago, that my muscles were hurting as a result of it. And that's because the transmitters were really close to the body. So I got in the general practice of keeping that away, and I wouldn't do any of that stuff until I built the technology because I know I'm not going to throw it away and I need the protection.
I think another thing we need to get into is grounding pads and even just grounding. I heard you speak on Dave Asprey's show and you gave your perspective on this. And it's interesting because grounding sheets and grounding pads is something, again, that I've used before. I'm sure many of our listeners might have them at home. So if you can explain why these aren't necessarily beneficial.
I was at a conference one time and one of the inventors of grounding came to me, and he wasn't an engineer. And he was explaining to me how things work. And I said, you don't understand physics. And we got into a debate. And what my argument was, in some space, it's great. In others, the claims are totally inaccurate. And this is what I meant. Your body acts as a capacitor. If you put wool socks on and you drag them around a rug and then you touch a doorknob, you'll get a little shock. That's because your body is absorbing the static electricity within your environment. And so when I say you're a capacitor, you have the capacity to absorb, but not discharge that energy that's being absorbed by your body. So if you have a grounding pad and you put your bare foot on a grounding pad, that is a path that goes to the wiring in the house to a electrical panel in your house that's grounded with a 6-foot rod into the ground. And so when you put your foot on, you discharge. And so some of us actually seem to have an excess amount of charge. And so when we put our foot on these things, it actually helps us feel so much more better. It's because there's a more of electrical balance in the body. So grounding pads are wonderful and absolutely do work for that problem. And it does solve a lot of human problems related to that imbalance. What it won't do, if you put a cell phone to your head and you talk for 3 hours when talking to a friend and you have your foot on a pad, it does absolutely nothing because the transmission's going into your head and it's not finding the path to ground. So if you think you're safe because somehow or other you have put your foot on a grounding pad and you think you're safe from all of the emissions in your environment, it's just not true. If you had a Wi-Fi transmitter that was transmitting right next to your head for 10 hours a day and you were grounded, there would still be a greater likelihood of neurological or some other forms of change within the body because of that exposure. So maybe that helps.
Now we're going to take another quick break from our chat with Dan to give a shout out to our show partner, Sun Warrior.
The Liquid Light is one of our favorite products, and what I love most about it is that it's detoxifying your body, and it's something you can have first thing in the morning. It's loaded with minerals, including folic acid and iron, and it's such a great way to have it absorbed in liquid form. So all you need to do is put a capful in your water, sip it down. It doesn't taste like much. You can also mix it in with something else, like a little bit of Ormus Super Greens or even a little bit of blueberry juice if you want. But otherwise, it tastes good on its own. If you haven't tried the Liquid Light yet, get your hands on it and add it to your agua today.
And as a listener of our show, you get 10% off all your Sun Warrior purchases. To take advantage, go to ultimatehealthpodcast.com/SW. Again, that URL is ultimatehealthpodcast.com/SW. And for listeners in the US and Canada, you can bundle your order together, spend $100 or more, and you get free shipping. Go and load up your cart with Liquid Light today. You are going to love it.
Now I'm going to read an amazing review from one of our listeners. This is coming from Abby McClure from the USA. She gave us 5 stars, and it's titled Best Podcast Ever. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and this is my absolute favorite. The information is incredible, and the entire show is so streamlined and put together. There isn't any rambling or useless content. Jesse and Marni do an amazing job at talking all about different health and nutrition views without talking negatively. Not only do they provide an outstanding podcast, but they seem like genuine, authentic people as well. Thank you for putting so much heart into your podcast. Thank you so much, Abby. This is such a beautiful review, and it just makes us so happy to read these. We get them all the time, and we want to keep getting more of them. So Jesse's going to let you know how to leave us a review.
Thank you so much for the kind words, Abby. And yes, if you haven't left us a review on Apple Podcasts, it's super easy to do. Go to ultimatehealthpodcast.com/Apple review. Again, that URL is ultimatehealthpodcast.com/Apple review. We really appreciate you taking the time to review the show, and we thank you ahead of time. And now back to our chat with Dan. I want to get into now the ever-evolving cell phone signals. And where we're at right now, we have the 4G LTE. And I think it was in your book you talked about in 2016, the 5G started to unroll. And I'd just love for you to talk about the difference now going to 5G, what that means, how that's impacting the human body.
I would love to talk about this. This is a very important subject, in my opinion. 1G is the first generation transmission. It was a sine wave frequency around 900 megahertz. I mentioned before a hertz is 1 cycle per second. A kilohertz is 1,000 cycles per second. A megahertz is 1,000,000 cycles per second. So the starting point for 1G was about 900 megahertz, 900 million cycles per second. And it was a constant load. In other words, when it would be transmitted, it wasn't a digital signal. Why is that important? Because when we came to 2G up to 4G, we began digitizing the signal. And we began encoding the signal. And it became an on and off, on and off, on and off data that traveled on the carrier frequency of 9 megahertz. An analogy of that is if I take a 10,000 pound steel bar and I put it on a piece of concrete and I expect it to break, it won't. The concrete will not crack under 10,000 pounds constant static load. When we went 2 to 4G, we actually now had a on-off, on-off, on-off signal on the carrier. What did that mean to the cell? It meant that it was not a static load to the cell membrane, for example, a direct membrane load. It was now on-off. In other words, it became a jackhammer. If you take that 10,000 pound load and I lift it up and drop it down, the concrete will break. And so when we went from 2 to 4G, it became a digital signal, which was even more dangerous than the analog 1G. Now we come to 5G. What is 5G? Well, up to 4G, it's around 2 gigahertz, 2 billion cycles per second. That was roughly the maximum speed of the 4G space. When you go to 5G, it can be up to 300 gigahertz, 300 billion cycles per second hitting the cell of the body. Why is that important to know? Because it's very, very fundamentally different than any previous technologies we've had in our environment. And by the way, there is no scientific study work and research on what does up to 300 gigahertz mean to the body. No one knows. So when we're going from 4G to 5G, there is literally no study work on what the impact to the body will be. So anybody who's in this business can only speculate what the potential could be based on understanding and knowledge of the environment that we live in. So when you're within 1,000 feet of a cell tower, you are 3 times more likely to have cancer. With 5G, they don't have the capacity to transmit any farther than 850 feet. So cell towers will be in front of every house, almost every other house, because they will be 850 feet apart. So is that a problem? We do know statistics tell us what the other problems are related to those who live near it. At this point, everybody will live near it. The other interesting fact in science we know is that bugs do really well in this. Bacteria and virus actually flourish and replicate at an accelerated rate. And so is that good for our bodies? Well, we already know the immune system is suppressed from these emissions. Further suppression, having a device that actually propagates virus and bacteria at an accelerated rate, may be not a good thing for us to have. But here's something we do know. At 90 gigahertz, we know the body resonates. We know that your sweat gland is a helical device that's under the skin and acts as an antenna for 90 gigahertz. We know that if it hits your body, you're going to feel hot because it's attracting that RF signal. In fact, it's used for crowd control. 90 gigahertz is literally used in crowd control. They transmit it into the environment and people run away screaming, my body's burning up. Well, that's why. The sweat glands are absorbing it at a faster rate than it typically does at other frequency rates. So this 5G is an unknown space. Research has not had time to investigate, and these technologies are being deployed. That's not true in other parts of the world. Other parts of the world have decided that they'd rather do some investigation on the health of the body when exposed to this, and there may not be any problems at all. But if anybody tells you it's not dangerous, they don't know anything about the science. None of us know what the impact is. So 5G is coming about, and it's starting to go into spaces that we've never been in our environment. There is nothing like this in our environment. And now we're going in areas where we don't know how the body will resonate in that space. And by the way, to continue the story, 6G is coming probably within 2 years or so in trial. And you're talking about terahertz, trillions of cycles per second. And as you may know, Jesse, you're beginning to become an ionized signal. What do I mean by that? We haven't spoke about ionized versus non-ionized, but ionized is X-rays. They're in the terahertz range. There's a real reason when you go to the dentist and they throw this really, really heavy lead thing on top of your chest, they run into the other room, they click something, you hear zzz, and then they look around and see if you're still there. That's an X-ray, which is ionized. What happens when you're exposed to an ionized signal like that is the electron that's orbiting the nucleus of the cell is knocked out of its orbit. The power level is so strong, it disrupts it, and that mutates the cell and causes the cancer. So we're beginning to approach some of these speeds, which we know from science can be dangerous at higher power levels. And what we've found, and there's claims that those power levels, the power levels of the transmissions of the cell phones will be much less and therefore safe. But I don't know if that's exacting science, because I explained to you when your blood-brain barrier is down, 0.1 watts. You don't have meters accurate enough to read 0.1 watts per kilogram, by the way. So I'm not a fan.
You talk about meters measuring the EMFs. Are there specific tools that you recommend people can have at home to get measurements of different electronic devices around the home and just check things out?
I really don't recommend that, Jesse, because what I've found is people begin panicking, and they're notoriously inaccurate in general. Unless you spend $10,000, you can't get something accurate in any way, shape, or form. It's an indicator. If you go through a logical sequence and you look within your environment and you look at the sources within that environment and you turn them off, the sources of the transmissions, that's the only thing you're going to be able to do with a meter is find those. If you're diligent in looking, chances are you're going to be pretty safe. So I don't really recommend those meters.
Okay. Earlier when we were talking about the smart meters, you touched on the fact that EMFs can impact our sleep. And I want to open this up and get into how these are impacting our sleep. But to start off, I want to tell a little story about my current situation where I'm sleeping right now. I actually have a wall socket right by my head. So I'd love for you to talk about the impact of that and in general, how EMFs are impacting our sleep.
It can be significant. I was interviewed a few months ago, and there was a lady interviewing me, very, very nice lady. And she says, what should I do about sleeping? And I said, you have to remove every source in your bedroom from emissions. You don't want a cell phone. Believe it or not, even a clock. Make sure a clock is 3 to 4 foot away from you. You absolutely don't want routers, and you don't want current flow in the walls. So you don't want little light bulbs running, low intensity light bulbs. You want nothing in your room. Why is that important? Well, because as we mentioned before, it's not just the cell that's impacted, it's functions of the body that are impacted. And the process of creating melatonin is actually mucked up and interfered with because of these signals. So you may feel sleepless at night. You may find it difficult to fall asleep. Some of that can be attributed to those kinds of emissions that are in your environment. So I told this interviewer that, and she was very, very polite. And she said, okay, thank you so much to help me with that. 2 months later, she had me on a show again. And she said to her audience, I now am sleeping at night, so is my husband. It turns out that it's no question about it. That can influence your sleep pattern. You want to remain as clean as possible. If you have a router, put it on a timer. Even if it's 20 foot away from you, put it on a timer at night, turn it off completely, because you want to minimize the sources and eliminate them if you can. If you're reading at night, you want to make sure that blue light blocking glasses. Why is that important? Now, we haven't talked about the visible light component of the spectrum, but that is electromagnetic radiation. Light is electromagnetic radiation. Ultraviolet light is known as a carcinogenic. So very close to that is blue light. In other words, the power strength of blue is almost as much as ultraviolet and much less than red and other colors in the spectrum. When you're reading at night, it's actually your circadian rhythm is being screwed up. Your sleeping patterns are potentially being adjusted because the neurological impact from those exposures are rearranging the brain and how it works. So you really want to make sure that if you choose to read in bed at night, that you are protected. Either you have your device that puts it at night mode, or you use glasses that protect you and shield you from that light. As a side note, by the way, blue light is also in science been identified as the source of dry eye. So several of us who have dry eye and have to put drops in our eye, the reasons could be that it's the blue component. If you're looking at a screen all day, that could be part of the reasons why you're having dry eye. And of course, there's premature macular degeneration related to that as well. You can be thrown into having damaged eye performance earlier than maybe it would under normal circumstances be. So there's real reasons to make sure that in your sleep, you're managing that environment.
Is it helpful to use night shift during the day on your computer?
Yeah, what that does, it takes the blue component out. That's what it does. It's like 440 nanometers. It just takes it out.
So you recommend that day and night or just at night?
Yes. During the day, our bodies are very tolerant of the blue component, but it is a strain on that eye, and particularly at night. So we have people we deal with that use a lighter version of blue light shielding during the day than they do at night. They use a very high shielding standard at night.
Gotcha. And that's where the yellow tinted glasses come in for during the day.
Yeah,
and
right.
we also have the orange tinted glasses for watching Netflix or whatever movies at night. So that makes sense.
Do PCs also have a night shift? Like, I'm talking for Mac users. So I'm just curious what the PC computer has.
I think the recent ones do.
Okay, great.
Yeah. And actually your cell phone has it too.
Yes.
Devices are coming out with this feature. So yeah, if they have it, do it.
Great. I'm glad we got into the impacts of light. And earlier you touched on putting the Wi-Fi router on a switch to shut off automatically at night.
Right.
And that's actually something we recommend as well, and we do as well, because it's so easy. You can just go to the hardware and get one of these switches, set it and forget it, and that's done. So
right.
Ours goes off, I think it's around 10 p.m. at night, comes back on around 7 a.m., and it just shuts that Wi-Fi signal off. So it's just fantastic.
Yeah, it's like $10 and you eliminate the threat. In this particular person I was talking to several months ago, it really made a fundamental difference in their sleeping pattern. And so for $10, you have at a minimum peace of mind.
Gets rid of one of the bees.
Right, gets rid of one of the bees in the room.
So we're speaking from the perspective of we're in a house right now. We did live in an apartment before, but just to share for the people who are living in an apartment or a condo, what's the impact? If they turn off their Wi-Fi signal, they're still being bombarded by all the other people in the building. So what can these people do?
Nothing.
Is turning off their Wi-Fi helpful a little bit?
No, they have shields that can be put on the walls that can terminate the RF signal from Wi-Fi. But I think that's extreme. It turns out, remember, the power levels drop really, really fast. Most of these devices transmitting all around you and you can see them, but they're very, very low signal level. So most of the time you're fine. It's the electric hypersensitive that's a problem. And for them, they can remove every bee in their room and they still have adjacent bees. And for them, they have to take more extreme measures with curtains that have the shielding in it. Some use paint. They have a conductive paint that they put on their walls. It's not that great, but it actually helps.
This actually makes me think of a Netflix show that Jesse and I are watching right now called Affliction, and it's showing different people who are exposed and sensitive to different things from mold to EMFs and the extreme measures they have to take to protect themselves. It's an interesting series. I'm not sure if you've seen it yet or if any of our listeners have, but I recommend you check it out. It's quite fascinating.
By the way, Marty, you bring up a very, very good point. If you're electric hypersensitive, it's 99.9% likely you're multiply chemically sensitive to volatile organic compounds, chemicals in the air, vapors in the air. And if you are to either one, it gets worse with age. So you really want to make sure you're managing the bees in the room because it becomes worse as you get older.
And I also want to touch on, too, that another option other than setting the Wi-Fi timer is just shutting off the breaker to the bedroom, to the Wi-Fi unit. And this is actually something Marni and I did for a period of time. We shut off the breaker to the bedroom until about a week or two later, we realized that our freezer in the basement was on the same breaker and we were shutting that off every night. So we're still in the process of moving that freezer to another room so we can get back into that habit. But I think that's another option for people.
Yeah, actually, a lot of people do that. And remember when I was talking about your bedroom and I mentioned make sure there's no night lights and stuff like that? That's when there's current flow in the wall. It turns out if you terminate those devices, then they're not drawing current. Even though the breaker's on, there is no current flow. It's when there's current flow that's a problem. But in general, to be assured that you are making a safe environment, particularly in the bedroom, throwing a switch is one of the easiest things to do.
Right. So in my case, if there's nothing plugged into that socket right by my head, it's not going to be pulling the current out and I really don't have to worry about it?
Yeah, exactly.
Excellent.
It's the current flow that creates the three-dimensional signal that's coming out as an emission from the wiring.
Well, we're definitely going to figure out how to move that freezer, shut the breaker off at night, and have maximum protection down the line. But
get an extension cord.
There you go. I like it. Temporary solution. So, Dan, in wrapping up here, you've shared so much great information on EMFs. This is such an important topic for our listeners. But is there any parting words you want to share, final thoughts that you think are important that we didn't cover?
Yeah, the 5G is the Mexican killer bee, in my opinion. When you're asked for service, most of the service is going to be to your router. They're trying to bypass the cable plant and they're trying to make it wireless to reduce their costs. And you're not necessarily gaining many, if any, benefits for your personal use. So I recommend a way to minimize that 5G. I have a neurologist buddy of mine. He called me on Saturday morning one day and he said, I got a headache. I can't stand it. Something's going on. And he had just moved into a place. So I asked him to go to the router and look and see if there were wires or how it's actually operating. It turned out it was a 5G router. And I said, turn it off. And within a few hours, his headaches went away. So it's really important as we evolve towards this new technology that we're even more diligent than we are with past technologies on trying to reduce the bees in the room.
Thank you so much. And Dan, other than our listeners getting a copy of Radiation Nation, what is the best way to connect, keep in touch, get themselves some DefenderShield products? Where can they go?
They can go to DefenderShield.com and they can find the book, they can find our products, but just as important, we have a huge library of data available to those who come to the site about where research is in science. We spend a lot of time making sure we offer an understanding, even if you don't buy our products, at least you'll have a better sense. Like Buy Our Initiative, links are there. We have all the studies that are broken down in body impacts. So go to DefenderShield.com and you'll find not just products that can protect you, but also information that may be able to help.
Excellent. And listeners, as always, we're going to have everything linked up over at ultimatehealthpodcast.com. So you can go there, one-stop shop, and everything will be linked up. And Dan, I just want to thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been so great, and we wish you all the best.
Thank you so much, Dan. We hope you enjoyed today's episode with Daniel. Lots of great information about how to protect yourself from EMFs. And if you enjoyed today's episode, let us know over on Instagram and tag Ultimate Health Podcast and DefenderShield. Let us know what you love most and let us know which products you're thinking about getting. In fact, we have a special coupon code for you guys.
DefenderShield is hooking you guys up as listeners of our show. You get 20% off any of their products. And this is a special code they've given to listeners of our show, Ultimate Health 20. It's good till January 31st, 2019, so go take advantage. And this isn't an affiliate code. We don't get any kickback from this. This is purely a discount for you guys to help protect yourselves from EMFs. Go over to our show notes over at ultimatehealthpodcast.com/264. You're going to have a link there to go to the DefenderShield website and use the code Ultimate Health 20. Go and take advantage today. Before we let you guys go, I want to give some love to our editor and engineer, Jace Sanderson, over at podcasttech.com. Jace, thanks for doing such a great job putting the show together. And this week's fun fact about Jace is that no matter how busy he is with work, he gets out walking every day. Jace, I love the walks too and try and get out every day as well. Right on. Listeners, have an awesome week. We'll talk soon. Take care.